On a rain-drenched street in Glasgow's Gorbals in 1967, a 23-year-old enforcer for the city's ruthless loan sharks confronted a rival. A routine debt collection spiraled into chaos. A knife flashed, blood stained the pavement, and the man lay dead, carved from jaw to gut. The young hardman was locked behind Barlinnie's iron bars and branded the nation's most violent prisoner. Yet this wasn't just a thug's downfall. It sparked the beginning of something. A transformation that defied the penal system, forging an artist, author, and activist from a killer's shadow. Welcome to Crime Pulse, where we expose the raw truth behind Britain's darkest crimes. If you're new here, please subscribe as we unravel one of the biggest underworld cases laid hidden. Your support ensures we can keep unraveling these tales, delivering them straight to your feed with every new video. Leave a comment with your thoughts on this case to spark conversations about justice. Now, stay tuned for a pulse-pounding dive into Glasgow's underworld. Glasgow's Gorbals, 1944, a decaying slum where coal smoke hung heavy, and tenements stood like jagged teeth against a grey sky. Poverty here wasn't just hardship, it was a blade, cutting dreams to ribbons. On May 17th, James Jimmy Boyle was born into this unforgiving world, the son of a tight-knit but fractured family. His father, a known safe-breaker in the Gorbals underworld, earned a fearsome name through petty heists and street hustles. But illness struck him down in his 30s, leaving Jimmy, barely 4, without a father's shadow to guide him. His mother, a cleaner toiling over endless floors for meager wages, fought to keep 4 boys fed. In a place where razor gangs ruled, and survival demanded fists or cunning, her struggle offered little shield against the street's pull. Of the 4 Boyle brothers, only Jimmy heard the call of his father's path, a destiny that seemed written in blood and poverty. School held no answers. He called himself a dunce in his 1977 memoir, A Sense of Freedom, a failure in a system that ignored kids like him. By primary school, he was pilfering sweets and cloves, each theft a small defiance against hunger and shame. At 13, he turned to cracking vending machines, pocketing coins until the law caught up. A stint in an approved school, a grim reformatory meant to straighten wayward boys, only sharpened his edge, teaching him survival over salvation. By 16, Jimmy was cracking safes, his hands steady as he pried open the Gorbals' locked treasures. Each heist was a thrill, a middle finger to the world that shunned him, but the stakes climbed higher. At 18, he faced Borstal, Scotland's brutal youth detention, where beatings and isolation crushed weaker souls. Boyle emerged tougher, his spirit forged in defiance rather than broken by punishment. He found a twisted family in the Cumbie gang, a crew of machete-wielding terrors who ruled Glasgow's underworld with blood and fear. All I saw was drinking, fighting, thieving, he wrote. To survive, I did the same. Boyle's frame, hardened by street brawls, became his weapon. He ran shebeens, hidden dens where bootleg whiskey flowed, fueling the Gorbals' restless nights. As a tallyman for ruthless moneylenders, he hunted debts from the desperate, enforcing loans swollen by predatory rates up to 1,000% interest, debts that could never be repaid, only collected in fear and blood. At 18, a bar fight turned ugly. He smashed a bottle into a man's face, blinding him in one eye. The cost was 2 years in prison, but Boyle's reputation only grew. Between prison stints, he fathered 2 children, James Jr. in 1966 and Patricia in 1967, with waitress Margaret Kinnear, fleeting moments of tenderness swallowed by his brutal world. By 21, Boyle had slipped through 2 murder trials, one ending in acquittal, the other collapsing when witnesses' homes were firebombed, their voices silenced by fear and flames. The system couldn't touch him, or so it seemed. Yet beneath the menace was a young man chained to the Gorbals code, loyalty to the gang above all, where unpaid debts could ignite violence, and weakness meant death. At 23, that code would pull him into a deadly confrontation that would define the rest of his life. Glasgow's 1960s underworld was a grim battleground of razor gangs, protection rackets, and loan shark syndicates, where loyalty was thin and betrayal meant a body in the Clyde. Jimmy Boyle didn't just thrive in this chaos, he ruled it. By 20, he was a feared tallyman, enforcing debts for moneylenders who bled the city's poorest dry. You owed Jimmy, you paid, or you paid in blood, a former associate told police in a 1970s statement. His violence was cold and calculated, his boyish face hiding a vicious streak that made the brutality more shocking. Earlier in 1963, aged 19, he stormed Govan Street in a drunken rage over a turf dispute, slashing 4 men with a blade, leaving them scarred and bleeding, court documents reveal. Fear was my currency, Boyle admitted in a 2010 BBC documentary. Control fear, you control the streets. His signature terror was the Glasgow smile, cheeks sliced ear to ear with razors and rulers, a permanent grin of agony. One debtor, per a 1966 police report, was chained to a radiator and beaten for missing a £10 payment. His cries lost in a Govan tenement. These weren't strangers, they were neighbours, men from his own streets, trapped in the same poverty that had forged him. By 23, dubbed Babyface by the press, Boyle was untouchable. Connections to London's Cray twins gave him a hideout after big jobs, slipping south to their East End pubs while Glasgow police circled. Jimmy was a name even we respected, a Cray associate recalled. But cracks appeared. Heavy drinking and amphetamines fueled paranoia, blurring the line between enforcer and addict. On July 7, 1967, a sticky summer night gripped Kinning Park, a hardscrabble corner of Glasgow's south side. Inside a Milne Park Street tenement, William Rooney, a wiry crook with a knack for dodging debts, owed £7, worth £150 today, to a merciless moneylender. Jimmy Boyle, fresh from pints at a Govan pub, was sent to collect. He knocked on Rooney's door, greeted by Sadie Kearney, Rooney's girlfriend. Bare-chested and half ready for bed, Rooney begged, "Jimmy, give me more time." But words turned to shoves to fists, and then a knife, either Boyle's or his mate William Wilson's, who was with him, sliced Rooney from jaw to pelvis. The truth blurred in the chaos and conflicting testimonies. Blood pooled on the floorboards as Rooney collapsed, his life draining away over a debt worth less than a week's wages. Boyle fled, pointing the finger at Wilson, clinging to the underworld's no-grassing code, even as blood stained his clothes. "I took 15 years for the Gangster badge of honor," he later wrote in A Sense of Freedom, a decision that would cost him everything. He bolted to London, holing up in a Bethnal Green pub run by the Cray twins, who valued his muscle but couldn't hide him forever. On September 20th, 1967, plainclothes police, disguised as factory workers, stormed the British Lion pub, guns hidden under overalls, and dragged Boyle out in cuffs. "They came like an army," he recalled. The Glasgow High Court loomed, where a swift verdict would shatter his empire of fear, beginning a reckoning he never saw coming. Extradited to Glasgow, Boyle faced trial at the High Court in November 1967. Detective Inspector Brian McLaughlin, tasked with interrogating him, recalled in his 2012 memoir, Crime Stopper, he paced his cell like a caged beast, eyes like knives. The evidence was damning. Witness testimonies, blood on Boyle's clothes, per court records. William Wilson, tried alongside him, walked free, cleared of Rooney's murder. But for Boyle, the City of Glasgow police had their third-time lucky triumph. Before sentencing, Lord Cameron branded Boyle a dangerous menace to society, ordering a life sentence with a minimum of 15 years before parole, a lifetime for a 23-year-old who'd never imagined growing old. As detectives in the High Court cells taunted him, "You're finished, Jimmy," Boyle sneered from the dock, "You'll never tame me." Words that would haunt him for years, a promise he'd eventually break in ways no one could predict. Glasgow exhaled, having caged one of the first high-profile killers convicted after the death penalty's abolition in 1965. Yet the victory was tense. Witnesses required police protection, as 3 men, including lawyer James Latter, faced lengthy sentences for firebombing their homes to silence them. As Barlinnie's gates slammed shut with the finality of iron on stone, the city braced for what a caged predator might unleash next, not knowing that behind those bars, the real battle was only beginning. Jimmy Boyle's life sentence thrust him into the heart of Scotland's penal inferno, a merciless world where rage and defiance became his only language. Barlinnie Prison, Glasgow's ironclad fortress, was his first battleground. Just 2 months after his 1967 conviction, the 23-year-old lashed out with chilling precision, smashing the assistant governor's face, breaking a bone. The cost was steep, an additional 18 months, a sign of the war he'd wage against the system. By October 1968, Boyle was caged in Peterhead, a bleak northern prison where icy cells broke weaker men. His rebellion flared again, this time against 2 officers who bore the brunt of his fury. Found guilty of assault, he earned 4 more years, each day hardening his resolve. In June 1970, at Inverness's Porterfield prison, Boyle's anger erupted during a riot. He attacked 2 officers and the governor, their authority a red rag to his defiance. The punishment, another 6 months, stacking time onto a sentence that felt endless. Boyle's resistance took darker forms. In solitary pits dubbed the cages, Scotland's Siberia, he smeared his cell walls with excrement, a desperate shield against guards' brutality. It was me against them, he recalled, his protests as raw as the system's cruelty. Yet beneath the rage and filth, something unexpected stirred. Sympathetic officers, risking protocol and their own safety, began slipping books through his cell bars, weekly contraband of a different kind. But the violence hadn't finished with him yet. By May 1973, his rage peaked at Porterfield. Leading a riot, he orchestrated a knife attack on 6 officers, a bloody clash that left him with 50 stitches in his scalp, blood crusting his face. The courts added 6 years for attempted murder, cementing his title as Scotland's most dangerous man, even while in prison. 5 years into his sentence, Boyle was a caged storm, unyielding and unbroken, yet those smuggled books had cracked something open. Transferred back to Barlinnie in 1973 as a last resort, he seemed beyond redemption. Yet, in the disused women's wing, a radical experiment, the Barlinnie Special Unit, was poised to challenge the beast within, offering a flicker of humanity in a place designed to crush it. By February 1973, with Boyle's violence unyielding despite the books that had begun to crack his armor, the system tried a radical shift. He was among the first transferred to Barlinnie's Special Unit, a daring experiment conceived by Officer Ken Murray. Housed in a disused women's wing, the BSU held 10 of Scotland's worst, gangsters and lifers like Boyle, in a prison within a prison. Beds replaced concrete slabs, truss replaced batons, and open visits hinted at humanity. "I thought it was a trick," Boyle admitted in a 2014 Times interview. Art therapist Joyce Laying handed him clay and chisels. Hands once shattering bones, now molded raw, anguished sculptures, each stroke chipping away at his rage. At first, he attacked the clay with the same fury he'd once unleashed on men, smashing, breaking, starting over. But gradually, something shifted. The violence in his hands gave way to precision, to creation. He crafted Gulliver, Europe's largest concrete sculpture, for Edinburgh's Craig Miller Festival Society in 1976. A towering symbol of defiance transformed into hope. His work was raw, visceral, figures twisted in agony and emergence, reflecting the war within him. Gallery visitors who saw his sculptures couldn't believe they came from the same hands that had once carved Glasgow smiles into debtors' faces. Words became his second weapon. In 1977, hunched over an old typewriter in the BSU, Boyle poured his life, crime, conviction, and awakening into a sense of freedom, published to acclaim. It sold millions by 1978. Its raw honesty inspiring a 1979 film starring David Heyman as Boyle. The book didn't sanitize his brutality. It confronted it head-on, forcing readers to reckon with both the monster he'd been and the man he was becoming. No longer just a street thug. He baked bread in the unit's kitchen, debated philosophy with visitors, and mentored younger inmates struggling with their own demons. His charisma and articulate voice stunned those who knew only the Babyface legend. In 1978, psychiatrist Sarah Trevelyan, daughter of John Trevelyan, the British Board of Film Censors secretary, visited after reading his book. Her Oxford Polish met his Gorbals grit. Their bond, forged in open visits where they talked for hours about art, literature, and redemption, led to a 1980 marriage that silenced skeptics and tabloid cynics alike. Critics sneered it was manipulation, but those who witnessed their connection saw something genuine. Two people finding common ground across an impossible divide. The BSU wasn't flawless. Fights flared, whiskey was smuggled, and old habits died hard. Some inmates never changed. The unit couldn't save everyone. But for Boyle, it worked a kind of miracle. The structure gave him responsibility, cooking meals, organizing art exhibitions, engaging with the outside world through controlled visits. He wasn't coddled. He was challenged to confront the wreckage of his past while building something new. The unit didn't fix me, Boyle told the BBC in 2024. It gave me a mirror to see the man I could be. By his 1982 parole, after 15 years behind bars, Boyle emerged transformed. A sculptor whose works fetched thousands, an author whose voice echoed beyond bars, a husband to a woman who believed in his capacity for change. As he stepped into freedom, blinking in Glasgow's daylight, the unit's lessons carried him toward a life unimaginable in the Gorbals shadows. But the true test of his transformation was only beginning. Freedom, won after 15 years, was a fragile gift for Jimmy Boyle. In 1983, he and his wife Sarah Trevelyan launched the Gateway Exchange, a charity threading the needle of his life license ban on associating with ex-convicts, offering art therapy to addicts and troubled youth in Edinburgh. It became a beacon of hope, backed by Sean Connery and Billy Connolly. Former addicts spoke of his patience, his refusal to judge, his ability to see potential where society saw only waste. But bureaucracy and funding battles strangled the project after years of impact, a victim of red tape and lingering suspicion about its famous founder. Undeterred, Boyle's voice grew louder. He campaigned relentlessly for prison reform, appearing on radio programs, writing opinion pieces, and confronting politicians about Scotland's failing penal system. He mentored youth in rough Glasgow estates, visiting schools where his story served as both warning and inspiration. "I was you," he'd tell teenagers teetering on the edge, "and I nearly died in that life." He railed against the barbaric isolation of solitary confinement, the very cages that had once held him. Punishment should rehabilitate, not annihilate, he declared at a 1990s criminal justice conference, his words carrying the weight of a man who'd survived both extremes. His advocacy wasn't theoretical, it was testimonial, born from scars and lost years, yet the past clung to him like damp Gorbals fog, refusing to release its grip. In the 1960s, between prison spells, Boyle had fathered two children, James Jr. and Patricia. Their births came in fleeting moments of freedom, snatched between sentences. James arrived in 1966, while Boyle served 3 months in Barlinnie for a man's death, a telegram from Margaret announcing the news through prison bars. "I was really very happy," he wrote, in a sense of freedom. "It was something I could never have imagined, being a father." Released in January 1967, he returned to Margaret long enough to conceive Patricia, born in December 1967, just a month after his life sentence for Rooney's murder began. Contact with his children was sparse and heartbreaking, limited to supervised prison visits where small hands pressed against glass, and later, the more humane open visits at the special unit, where he could finally hold them. "I didn't get a chance to know my dad, apart from those visits," Patricia reflected in a 1999 interview. "He was this larger-than-life figure behind bars, but he wasn't there for birthdays, scraped knees, any of it." The guilt gnawed at Boyle, another price of his violent choices. Tragedy struck in 1994, a brutal echo of Boyle's own violent youth that must have felt like cosmic punishment. His eldest son, James Jr., then 27, had spiraled into heroin addiction, falling into the very trap Boyle's Gateway Exchange fought against, and served 3 years for robbery. In Glasgow's Oatlands, he crossed paths with Gary Moore, a notorious criminal suspected in different attacks. Moore stabbed James Jr. to death in a street confrontation that could have been ripped from Boyle's own past. Moore was later convicted of culpable homicide and sentenced to 8 years. Boyle mourned in silence, the pain too deep for public words. Friends reported he disappeared into his studio for weeks, channeling his grief into bronze and clay, his sculptures taking on darker, more tortured forms. The irony wasn't lost on him. He transformed, but couldn't save his own son from the streets that had forged him. It was a wound that never fully healed. His marriage to Sarah, strained by time, grief, and the weight of his past, ended in 2000 after 20 years. "We've grown in different directions," they said, in a joint statement, though friends suggested James Jr.'s death had fractured something fundamental between them. Retreating to a sunlit villa in Antibes, France, far from the Gorbals' gloom and Glasgow's ghosts, Boyle, now 80, sculpts sporadically. His bronzes command 6 figures at galleries across Europe, collectors drawn to the raw emotion his hands still pour into metal. The scars of his past, personal and criminal, linger like shadows, but his journey from cage to canvas offers a testament to redemption's fragile, imperfect power, setting the stage for a legacy that challenges justice itself. Jimmy Boyle's journey, from a Gorbals blade carving fear to an Antibes atelier sculpting hope, defies the notion that some souls are beyond saving. Once a tallyman who terrorized debtors with razors, he transitioned into a mentor for the marginalized, though his advocacy work quieted after relocating to France. His Gulliver sculpture, a towering concrete giant installed at Edinburgh's Craig Miller estate in 1976, was named a heritage site in 2023, hailed as outsider art's triumph, a physical monument to transformation rising from one of Scotland's most deprived neighbourhoods. Yet skeptics linger, and their questions cut deep. Critics have long questioned whether Boyle's reform was genuine or a clever manipulation of the system, a con man's greatest performance. Some sneered in newspaper columns and online forums, doubting the sincerity of his transformation. How convenient, they argued, that the man who orchestrated witness intimidation through firebombings suddenly discovered his conscience when art therapy was offered. But not all saw a con. Detective Brian McLaughlin, who once watched a caged Boyle pace like a predator during interrogations, met him years later during a hospital visit, while Boyle was still in Barlinnie. In his 2012 memoir, McLaughlin marveled at the change. Boyle was no longer the prowling animal I'd guarded over a dozen years before. The silent, brooding criminal had become erudite, talkative, incredibly charismatic. Officers who'd once feared his violence now feared more for his safety, his notoriety making him a target for inmates seeking reputation. "I was astonished," McLaughlin wrote, "if only all the villains I encountered could have gone straight as successfully." To some, Boyle remains fundamentally a killer cloaked in artistry, a man whose sculptures can't erase the blood on his hands, whose eloquence can't resurrect William Rooney. To others, he's living proof that even the hardest can change, that writing people off as irredeemable creates the very monsters we fear. His life challenges society to decide, do prisons breed monsters or mend men? Are we willing to invest in the difficult, expensive, uncertain work of rehabilitation, knowing some will fail? The answer matters beyond one man's story, and who we're willing to become in making that choice. Drop your thoughts below. Does a man like Boyle ever truly escape his past? Can transformation coexist with accountability? Thanks for joining Crime Pulse as we unearth the raw truths of redemption's edge. Subscribe to keep these stories alive. Stay fierce, stay informed, and join us for the next dive into Britain's hardest lives.